Historians can only establish what probably happened in the past. The problem with historians is they can't repeat the experiment. Today, if we want proof for something, it's very simple to give proof for many things. In the natural sciences, the experimental sciences, we have proof. If I wanted to prove to you that bars of ivory soap float, but bars of iron sink, all I need to do is get 50 tubs of lukewarm water and start chucking in the bars. The ivory soap will always float, the iron will always sink, and after a while we'll have a level of what you might call predictive probability. That if I do it again, the iron's going to sink again and the soap's going to float again. We can repeat the experiments doing experimental science, but we can't repeat the experiments doing history, because once history happens, it's over. What are miracles? Miracles are not impossible. I won't say they're impossible. You might think they are impossible. If you do think so, then you're going to agree with my argument even more than I'm going to agree with my argument. I'm just going to say that miracles are so highly improbable that they're the least possible occurrence in any given instance. They violate the way nature naturally works. They are so highly improbable, their probability is infinitesimally remote, that we call them miracles. No one on the face of this earth can walk on lukewarm water. What are the chances that one of us can do it? Well, none of us can. So let's say the chances are 1 in 10 billion. Well, suppose somebody can. Well, then it's a chance in 1 in 10 billion. But in fact, none of us can. What about the resurrection of Jesus? I'm not saying it didn't happen, but if it did happen, it would be a miracle. The resurrection claims are claims that not only did Jesus' body come back to life, it came back to life never to die again. That's a violation of what naturally happens. Every day, time after time, millions of times a year. What are the chances of it happening? Well, it'd be a miracle. In other words, it'd be so highly improbable that we can't account for it by natural means. A theologian may claim that it's true. And to argue with the theologian, we'd have to argue on theological grounds, because there are no historical grounds to argue on. Historians can only establish what probably happened in the past, and by definition, the miracle is the least probable occurrence. And so, by the very nature of the canons of historical research, we can't claim historically that a miracle probably happened. By definition, it probably didn't. And history can only establish what probably did. I wish we could establish miracles, but we can't. It's no one's fault. It's simply that the canons of historical research do not allow for the possibility of establishing the as probable, the least probable of all occurrences. For that reason, Bill's 4 pieces of evidence are completely irrelevant. There cannot be historical probability for an event that defies probability, even if the event did happen. The resurrection has to be taken on faith, not on the basis of proof. Let me illustrate by giving you an alternative scenario of what happened to explain the empty tomb. I don't believe this. I don't think it happened this way. But it's more probable than a miracle happened, because a miracle, by definition, is the least probable occurrence. So let me give you a theory, just one I dreamt up. I could dream up 20 of these that are implausible, but are still more plausible than a resurrection. Jesus gets buried by Joseph of Arimathea. 2 of Jesus' family members are upset that an unknown Jewish leader has buried the body. In the dead of night, these 2 family members raid the tomb, taking the body off to bury it for themselves. But Roman soldiers on the lookout see them carrying the shrouded corpse through the streets. They confront them and they kill them on the spot. They throw all 3 bodies into a common burial plot, where within 3 days these bodies are decomposed beyond recognition. The tomb then is empty. People go to the tomb, they find it empty. They come to think that Jesus was raised from the dead. And they start thinking they've seen him, because they know he's been raised because his tomb is empty. This is a highly unlikely scenario. But you can't object that it's impossible to have happened, because it's not. People did raid tombs. Soldiers did kill civilians on the least pretext. People were buried in common graves left to rot. It's not likely, but it's more likely than a miracle, which is so unlikely that you have to appeal to supernatural intervention to make it work. This alternative explanation I've given you, which again is not one that I believe, is at least plausible. And it's historical as opposed to Bill's explanation, which is not a historical explanation. Bill's explanation is a theological explanation. The evidence that Bill himself doesn't see his explanation as historical is that he claims that his conclusion is that Jesus was raised from the dead. Well, that's a passive. Was raised. Who raised him? Well, presumably God. This is a theological claim about something that happened to Jesus. It's about something that God did to Jesus. But historians cannot presuppose belief or disbelief in God when making their conclusions. Discussions about what God has done are theological in nature. They're not historical. Historians, I'm sorry to say, have no access to God. The canons of historical research are by their very nature restricted to what happens here, on this earthly plane. They do not and cannot presuppose any set beliefs about the natural realm. I'm not saying this is good or bad. It's simply the way historical research works. Let me give you an analogy. It's not bad that there can be no mathematical proof for the existence of an anti-Semitic polemic in the Merchant of Venice. Mathematics is simply irrelevant to purely literary questions. So too, historical research cannot lead to theological claims about what God has done. To sum up, the sources we have are not as good as we would like. They're written many decades after the fact by people who were not there to see these things happen, who have inherited stories that have been changed in the process of transmission. These accounts that we have of Jesus' resurrection are not internally consistent. They're full of discrepancies, including the accounts of his death and his resurrection. But there's a problem of miracle. It's not the philosophical problem of miracle discussed in the 17th and 18th centuries. It's a historian's problem of miracle. Historians cannot establish miracle as the most probable occurrence because miracles, by their very nature, are the least probable occurrence. Thank you.